Yeah, we heard on our first course on May 18th on energy adequacy and capacity accreditation. On June 1st, we explored load forecasting and electrification, and today we're going to wrap up with utility scale storage. So, I think this is a critical topic, particularly amidst the ongoing energy transition. So, please note all presentations for these courses are already available, including this one, for download on the site that you use to register. I'm also going to drop that into the chat. These courses are brought to you by a collaboration between NASEO, National Association of State Energy Offices, and the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, and NARUC. Regarding our format and logistics today, we're going to be hearing from 4 instructors, and Debbie Liu with eSig will be introducing them shortly. After you hear from them, we're going to do a general Q&A, and then you'll have the opportunity to join breakout rooms for 30 minutes, where you can ask more targeted questions to each of the instructors. Please try to avoid overcrowding any single room, and Jessica and I will be working to make sure these rooms don't get too full. We do have a Q&A feature here on the Zoom, and I encourage you all to use that to send along any clarifying questions, and also any more technical questions that you like addressed during the general Q&A. And then during the breakout sections, if you want to ask more pointed questions, that's the opportunity to engage with each instructor. I do want to thank the Energy Systems Integration Group, or ESIG, particularly Debbie Liu, who's really helped bring together the individuals here and throughout this series, and all their expertise. And I encourage you all to really take advantage of, again, the breakout rooms. I certainly recommend also checking ESIG's library of resources. Similarly, I'd suggest you also take a look at NARUC's resources on this topic, where we have a resource adequacy primer for state regulators that we put out in 2021, and we'll be releasing an update to that later in November. So stay tuned for that. Debbie Liu will be running today's training. And finally, I just want to thank the U.S. Department of Energy, who has funded this initiative along with many others to assist regulators, state energy officers, and consumer advocates as they sort of navigate the ongoing transition. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Elliot. I'm Debbie Liu. I'm the Associate Director of ESIG. Welcome to today's training module. Just for your background, ESIG, the Energy Systems Integration Group, we're an educational organization. We address technical challenges for transforming the grid. And as Elliot mentioned, there's a lot of information available at esig.energy, lots of videos, webinars, reports, and we're going to have a workshop next week, actually in Denver, June 13th to 15th, on electrification and load forecasting, if you're interested. So today we're going to talk about integration of utility scale storage, and we're really excited. We've got a really fantastic lineup today. We're going to start with Dr. Paul Denholm of NREL. He's a principal energy analyst and now a research fellow at NREL. He's been working on storage since before it became popular. He's been doing this since I met him about 20 years ago at NREL, and he's got a PhD in energy analysis from Wisconsin. He's going to be giving an overview of electrical storage. And then we've got Max Tutman from the ad hoc group. Max comes from DOE's RPE and has been helping startups and working on cutting edge technologies with new businesses. And he's introduced me to some really interesting technologies and business models and companies that are looking at different ways to do storage. He's going to be talking today with us on thermal energy storage. And Max comes from MIT and Brown University. Then we have Dr. Nikita Singhal from EPRI. Dr. Nikita Singhal is a technical leader in grid operations and planning at EPRI, and she also leads the Energy Storage Market Modeling Technical Working Group, at EPRI, which is an RTO group, where they're looking at how do you integrate storage into the markets, into system operations. And Dr. Singhal has a PhD from Arizona State University. And then Mark Ostrom from NextEra Energy. Mark is the Vice President of Renewable Energy Policy at NextEra, and he's also the president of our board at ESIG. And he also serves on a number of committees with NERC, SPP, and he's going to be talking with us today about hybrid resources and ways to think about hybrid resources, especially as a modular resource, and how this way of thinking about storage in hybrids can be a way of thinking about the grid in the future. And then finally, last but not least, Dr. Julia Matabosian, who is our chief engineer here at ESIG. She's got more than 20 years of experience in the power industry. She was the lead planning engineer at ERCOT before she joined us. Julia is going to be talking today about grid forming batteries and the opportunity to future-proof the system with this new technology. So the way this is going to work is we've got Paul, Max, and Nikita speaking. We'll have a short bio break, and then Mark and Julia will speak. We encourage you to ask your questions in the Q&A feature of the Zoom, and we'll be collecting those questions. We have a period of cross-cutting questions at 3:15, and then at 3:30, we'll go into breakout rooms. And again, you can ask your detailed questions and move freely among breakout rooms, and then we'll adjourn at 4. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Paul Denholm to kick us off on an overview of electrical storage. Paul?
Great, thanks, Debbie. Happy to be here and talk about energy storage and what the opportunities are, and particularly getting a lot of questions about the potential role of long duration storage. When might we transition to long duration storage? When might it be needed? And what are the relative economics of the different technologies? So let's just start with, we really need to discuss what the roles for storage are, and maybe also spend some time talking about the things that we shouldn't focus on as during this transition. I'll emphasize a little bit of that at the beginning, and then we'll talk in more detail about the possible transition to longer duration storage. Okay, so Debbie mentioned me doing work on storage before it was popular. And yeah, I mean, when I started, there really wasn't much going on. This is the recent storage installations between 2010 and 2022. Before 2010, basically nothing went in between like 2000 and 2010. We have all the legacy pumped hydro, tons and tons of pumped hydro, big fan of pumped hydro, but everything going in since then has been batteries and a smattering of a few other technologies. Potential opportunities for pumped hydro still, happy to talk about that, but right now, all the action is in batteries, and particularly in lithium-ion batteries. So basically every single battery that went in 2021 and 2022 was lithium-ion. Some small demonstration projects, but it's really been the lithium-ion show for the past several years. So we've got lithium-ion being kind of the exclusive energy storage technology going in, but then there's also the question of, well, what about the durations? How long is what's the duration of these storage technologies going on? And to the right, I've got a kind of a histogram of all the different durations. And what I've done here is broken it out by kind of the hourly classes, so less than an hour, 1 to 2 roughly. But also, I've also noted that there's exactly 1 hour storage, and then there's kind of between 1 and 2, and then likewise with 4. So you see the biggest kind of single bar is exactly 4 hours of storage, and overall a relatively small fraction of all the storage going in is greater than 5. So you kind of see this big cluster right around 1 hour, and then another big cluster around 4 hours. So the question is, why? What's going on? Why are utilities and developers either historically or presently doing kind of 1 hour storage or 4 hour storage? So we need to dig into that to understand the economics and the potential transition to other storage technologies. So the first thing that if you go to a storage conference, you always see some form of a chart like this in terms of, oh, all the different wonderful things that storage can do. You know, we talk about value stacking. And if you look at this kind of list of services, a huge fraction of them are what we would call either ancillary services or central reliability services, the short-term balancing services to deal with contingencies, short-term variations in supply and demand. And we spent a lot of time talking about that. And one of the reasons why we've historically spent a lot of time talking about that is because these are extremely well suited for energy storage. You don't need to have a whole lot of duration, 15 minutes, 30 minutes to respond. Storage is great because it responds really rapidly and can take advantage of kind of the price premium that exists for some of these services. So that's the early stage of storage. So when I talk about like these 1 hour or less than an hour batteries, a lot of this storage went into those markets for contingency reserves, frequency regulation or regulating reserves. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that. But maybe we don't need to talk about it as much anymore. This is the capacity required for 3 general classes of these operating reserves. And regulating reserves is the one that storage kind of went after most. And so it's significant. It's several thousand megawatts of capacity. But how does that compare to the amount of capacity we need for peaking or firm capacity? It's a pretty small fraction. These markets are rapidly saturating or have largely saturated. There's not a whole lot of room for growth for provision of ancillary services. There are some in some places, but in California, the entire regulating reserve market is 300 to 400 megawatts. So there's not a whole lot of room for growth in terms of providing ancillary services from storage. The focus has really shifted to the provision of peaking capacity. And that makes sense not only because saturation of the ancillary service markets, but because peaking capacity is now cost effective. We've achieved break-even point for lithium-ion batteries being cost competitive on a life cycle basis with a peaking so something like a flexible aeroderivative gas turbine. So if you do a kind of a full life cycle cost calculation, 4-hour storage can now compete against a new peaker. So if you've got load growth or if you've got an old peaker that's retiring, storage is now cost competitive. And we're seeing a lot of the storage going in for this capacity resource, particularly that 4-hour storage device. So how can storage provide firm peaking capacity? It's quite frankly because peaks don't last more than about 4 hours. So if you look all across the country outside of the Pacific Northwest, which is fairly strongly winter peaking, summer peaks are fairly narrow, just a few hours. So storage can charge up in the overnight periods, discharge during the peak periods, and reduce that net load peak from the kind of the curvy sine wave looking thing to that thing with a flat peak. That's storage clipping the peak and serving as an alternative to traditional capacity resources. And it is now cost competitive. Storage does often does work in winter as well. You can clip kind of the weird diurnal peak shape, but we're going to come back to this because winter peak is where we're going to see some differences in what particularly 4-hour storage can do. Okay, so how do we understand the value of storage in providing firm capacity? Because we know that unlike a gas turbine, assuming it can get fuel, it can't run forever. So that's where we have to do some math to understand what is the duration required. So you can do something like an effective load carrying capability calculation to see, okay, how can I rate a storage plant? So if I've got a 4-hour storage plant or 6-hour storage plant of 100 megawatts, can it actually replace a 100 megawatt gas turbine, or do I need to derate it? And ELCC calculations can be pretty tricky. And so what a lot of markets have done is come up with this simple threshold duration rule. And that basically says, thou shalt have at least X hours to be eligible to get full capacity credit. Now you can be derated, and you can kind of have this linear derate. So if you've got instead of, in this case, if you had a 4-hour rule, like a lot of locations like California has, you could derate that plant. So if you got like a 2-hour device, you could just derate it by half. So if you got a 100 megawatt 2-hour plant, you could rate it at 50 megawatts because you can then discharge it at 50 megawatts for 4 hours. Okay, so this is what's been done today, and this is part of the explanation about why we saw that big cluster of 4 hours, particularly in California. You need 4 hours to get full capacity credit. So let's just build a 4-hour storage device. And now we can enter into a resource adequacy contract. So a lot of load serving entities, load serving entities in California are required to have sufficient capacity to demonstrate sufficient capacity to meet resource adequacy. So that can be done through bilateral contracts. So a load serving entity can sign a bilateral contract with a storage developer. And if it's, as long as it's 4 hours, that load serving entity can then go to the California Public Utility Commission and say, okay, look, I've met my resource adequacy requirement through a mix of resources, including some 4-hour storage. So that's what markets do, and many markets do instead of doing an ELCC calculation, particularly because ELCC calculations can be quite difficult. So another reason why we tend to see this kind of stop at 4 hours is because, again, energy storage is getting value from multiple resources. But quite frankly, once you're out of kind of the ancillary services market, you're getting most of your value from the combination of a capacity payment of some sort, either through a market or through a bilateral contract, plus this energy time shifting value. Sometimes people call it energy arbitrage. I don't really care what you call it. Again, it's the buy low, sell high, and this provides value in non-market regions as well. This is a shape of a curve of how much of the value can I actually get as a function of duration? Because as you have longer duration storage, you arbitrage more and more hours of low to high prices. But if you look at kind of daily prices, you'll see that you get a few hours of really high prices and a few hours of really low prices. Once you've got 4 hours of storage, you've actually got well over half of basically the theoretical potential, because you've arbitraged away most of that day-night opportunity. And so going to longer duration storage can help, but you've captured most of the value. So the combination of that is, once you build up 4 hours of storage, you've gotten all of your capacity value that you can get. You've gotten most of your energy value. And so here are two examples of kind of a low region with low prices and a region with high prices. You've captured well over 80% of the potential value. So there's really no point in building more than 4 hours of storage. That extra hour, that battery is going to cost you something. And in most cases, the extra value that you get out of building a 5th hour of storage isn't worth the cost. So kind of that's where we're at right now in terms of storage. This why you see either people building 1 hour storage for ancillary services, some 1 hour storage in places like ERCOT to take advantage of those extremely high price differentials that you see for just like 1 or 2 hours per day, and then in places like California building 4 hour storage to get that payment, that combination of capacity payments and energy revenue. And 4 hours should be enough for now. When we do the math on these summer peaking systems, we see that 4 hours is enough. This is an example of looking at it in a kind of different way is, well, when we've had incidents, especially in summer peaking systems, was 4 hours enough? And in California, this is the 2020 outages, and the longest outage duration during those 2 days was about 2.5 hours. So if they'd had 2.5 hours of storage with sufficient megawatts of capacity, they could have avoided those outages, and they wouldn't have needed, again, they require 4, but they certainly wouldn't have needed more than 4 to avoid those outages. Okay, so what happens if we keep adding storage? I showed earlier kind of this flat peak. Well, look what happens on the left. I add some storage, and I add enough storage. My peaks are now more than 4 hours long. And in some cases, it doesn't take a whole lot of storage until my peak is more than 4 hours long, and I would need to go with longer duration storage. And that is true, except again, in summer peaking systems, if we add solar will chop off the left half of the peak curve and leave the right half of the peak curve for storage. But the combination of solar meeting the first half and storage meeting the second half means that I can go a really long way with 4 hours. 4 hour storage will be able to provide lots of capacity for a long time in the summer, as long as we keep adding more and more solar. Now you do eventually saturate, you do eventually get to the point where your peaks are longer than 4 hours. But quite frankly, the biggest transition occurs when we essentially shift to a net winter peaking system. And so this is the big deal. And quite frankly, this is the thing that scares me. Like I thought I kind of had a handle on, oh, this is great. Solar and storage are going to work great together. They're a peaking resource. They're cost effective. We really nailed it. This technology is going to answer all of our needs for peaking capacity. But again, winter does happen, and we're increasingly seeing the shift to winter peaks. The left-hand curve here is actual 2022 ERCOT data. The solid lines are the actual load. The dotted lines are the net load after the impact of PV and wind. Sorry, I should have said PV and wind in the caption. And essentially, if you take a look at the dotted lines, you will see that the orange dotted line is higher than the blue dotted line. That means in 2022, ERCOT was a net winter peaking system. And so if you look at the right curve or the right chart, that's the ratio of summer peak to winter peak. Doesn't matter. If it's less than 1, it's a winter peak. If it's greater than 1, it's a summer peak. Well, look, all of CERC, this is from NERC's projections. According to NERC, the Southeast is now winter peaking. Okay, so why is that a potential problem? It's because winter peaks are longer than summer peaks. Yeah, the solar thing, that's not going to help. I mean, solar not providing during the winter, that's a separate issue. But just bottom line, you put a little bit of storage in the system. So here's an example of adding 2,500 megawatts of storage to the system in ERCOT. Again, we've got a long ways to go with summer. I mean, I'm right at 4 hours, but add a little bit more solar to that, I'm fine. That summer peak, that winter peak on the right, that's the middle of the night. That's an overnight winter peak that's going to be 10, 12 hours long at some point with the addition of storage. Again, storage can do a lot right now. You can see storage clipping the peak, and it'll keep doing that. But I've added 2,500 megawatts, another 500, 1,000 megawatts. I've got like an 8 to 10 hour long peak. And so that really is the limitation of where we're at with this 4 hour storage thing. 4 hour storage is working great right now, but eventually it's not because of the shift to winter peaks. So the good news, though, again, is we can go a long way with economic energy storage. These are projections from NREL actually prior to the Inflation Reduction Act showing business as usual. And one of the cool things about talking about energy storage is it is policy neutral, it is technology neutral, and it is nonpartisan because I can show storage penciling out with zero regard of climate change or any environmental policies. It is just cost effective. And so in these scenarios, which were done before the Inflation Reduction Act, without any carbon policy, we see tremendous growth in energy storage because it is cost effective. And we do see this gradual transition towards longer duration storage. It's again deploying mostly 4 hour storage in this coming decade, and then transitioning, kind of in the next decade into 6 and eventually 8 hour storage. Now these curves are accelerated now because of the IRA, but we see the same kinds of trends. Hundreds of gigawatts of energy storage being deployed as peaking resources, and eventually transitioning to longer duration storage. One thing that's really important to talk about, if you're concerned about critical materials, if you're concerned about domestic manufacturing, any concerns around, okay, where are we going to get these batteries? How many do we need? It's EVs. That's going to drive the growth. Stationary storage is going to be almost an afterthought. So it's important. But again, on the manufacturing side, this chart compares a bunch of scenarios of decarbonization, lots of adoption of electric vehicles, and then across the board, even under cases where we build lots and lots of stationary storage, we still build way more electric vehicles. So just something to keep in mind. That's not really kind of core to my talk, but I think it's important to talk about just because, hey, are we going to be able to build all these batteries? Well, if we can't do it for stationary storage, we certainly can't do it for electric vehicles, because that's really the driving point. So I want to make sure that we had plenty of time for the other speakers and kind of just give you this overview, because I really think the key points here are fairly simple, and that is storage is cost competitive as a source of firm capacity. So if utility comes in with an IRP saying, storage is the way to go, that raises questions, well, what about traditional resources? That's why. It's because it's cost competitive. And quite frankly, I'm fairly skeptical of IRPs that would come in and say, oh, no storage, because again, we're seeing the numbers pencil out. Now, we do have a recent increase in commodity prices, and we'll have to see how that has affected recent prices. So there may be a temporary blip there. But I do believe that, straight up against the peaker, storage can increasingly compete if you do the analysis correctly. And then again, I think 4 hours is plenty for now and will be plenty for the near future, but it's really this transition to winter peaks that will drive durations beyond 4 hours. Now, I didn't talk about technologies, and happy to do that, but one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that lithium-ion battery prices are declining. And so increasingly the competition against a 4-hour lithium-ion battery may be a 6-hour or even an 8-hour lithium-ion battery. But there are a number of technologies that are really important to consider, and some of them are emerging in various stages of technological maturity. But it's great that we have a transition to a talk on thermal storage, because I think thermal storage is often overlooked. We've got a lot of kind of exotic battery chemistries that I think have promise. Again, I'm still a big fan of pumped hydro, but we really can't ignore all of the different technologies, including thermal storage, which will be the next talk. But with that, I will transition, and I don't know if we're taking questions now or later.
Thank you so much, Paul. So we're gonna take questions through the Q&A question feature, and we're gonna save questions for after everyone speaks, but please enter in your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much, Paul. That was a great overview and really insightful into how storage fits into today's system and then also in the future. So next, I'd like to transition over to Max Tutman from the ad hoc group, who's going to talk about thermal energy storage. Max, take it away.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Can I just get confirmation that at least one person sees my screen?
Yes, I can see it and I can hear you fine.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, and that's a great segue from Paul. So hi, everyone. My name is Max Tutman from the Ad Hoc Group. Ad Hoc Group is a small market development advisory firm that works with climate tech startups that are trying to navigate the energy transition. I will flag just right up top here that I do work with one thermal energy storage company, that's Rondo Energy, but I have experience working with a number of them through my former role at ARPA-E, and this is generally about thermal energy storage broadly. And you'll see that the subtitle here is "and industrial heat electrification," which I think will become clear as I get into this. Thermal energy storage, at least the portion I'll be talking about today, really has a lot to do with sector coupling with industrial heat use as well. So getting into this, we can see kind of the agenda of what I'll cover today. Each of these sections is short, but want to orient you here and start off with some of the basics of thermal energy storage. So thermal energy storage can take a number of forms, but I think generally it will have 4 key elements that I've shown here. So element 1 is that it charges from electricity. So this can be off-grid, charging directly from renewables, or this can be grid-tied, charging from the grid. The second element is that electricity gets converted to heat. And that generally happens in one of 2 ways. One is essentially a giant toaster, so that's what image there. And that is that the electricity is dumped into a giant resistive heater, much like a toaster, and used to heat something up. The second way that the electricity can be converted is through some sort of high temperature heat pump. So this is really kind of industrial version of the heat pumps you hear about for residential and commercial use. The next element of the yes.
Can you turn your video off? Because your sound is a little choppy. So maybe if you turn the video off, it'll be easier. Thanks.
Okay, is that sounding any better? Yeah,
that sounds better.
Okay, sorry about that. The second element, or the third element here, is the actual storage medium. So thermal energy storage, one of the key features of it is that the actual storage tends to be something extremely cheap. So that heat that's generated from either the giant toaster or the heat pump gets dumped into something like bricks or rocks or molten salts or something that is just very cheap to store heat. And then finally, that heat is discharged into some useful form. So that could be either discharged through a generating turbine to generate electricity, or it could be used directly as high temperature heat for some sort of industrial process. So this is the basics of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about thermal energy storage. When we look at thermal energy storage that's going to be converted back into electricity, generally the application for this, as Paul just alluded to, is for long duration energy storage. And the reason why thermal energy storage is seen as an attractive long duration energy storage application is precisely because that energy storage media, the rocks, the bricks, is so inexpensive. This means that as you go longer in duration, all you have to do is add more of those rocks or bricks. So while you might have an expensive or relatively expensive turbine generating the electricity, that turbine gets amortized over longer and longer durations as you add more and more rocks, making the slope of the line of this long duration energy storage cost line significantly less than lithium ion. Now, for that to be valuable at all, generally you need to get out to a duration, as Paul sort of alluded to, where you're adding some value other than just the energy arbitrage or something like that, where it has diminishing returns with duration. And instead you need to be on a system that values that long capacity, and it could be in that winter peaking type scenario. Transitioning away from the long duration storage application, the bulk of what I'm going to be presenting on here is really thermal energy storage for industrial heat decarbonization. And so this is really what happens when you take that heat and instead of using it to return electricity to the grid, you use it to drive industrial processes. And this is a really large opportunity. So over 20% of global CO2 emissions are derived from industrial heat. So this is the heating of industrial processes like metal treating, like coking, and a lot of boiling activities. A lot of manufacturing processes use steam in one way or another. That steam is generally generated through a fossil fuel boiler. So what's interesting is thermal energy storage is able to store this heat relatively inexpensively at very high temperatures. So temperatures in excess of 1500 degrees C. And these temperatures are able to address 95% of these industrial heat applications. And once you're using that amount of energy in these thermal energy systems, it provides some really interesting opportunities for how it might integrate into the grid, which I will get into. So to understand the opportunity here, it's important to understand why this is an opportunity now and what the underlying economics of this opportunity actually are. So why now? Why is this an interesting opportunity to electrify industrial heat through thermal energy storage? And the answer is really the falling cost of renewables. So just as lithium ion batteries have plummeted in cost, so too have solar panels and wind turbines. And when you look at some markets now, here I'm showing California, when you look at the cost to produce steam using power from a solar PPA versus the cost to produce steam from an 80 to 85% efficient natural gas boiler, you can see that we've actually reached a crossover point where steam from that energy from the solar PPA is less than steam from directly fossil-fired natural gas. This is like really a relatively new and monumental phenomenon that you would be able to generate electricity at a per unit energy cost less than from a fossil source on a heat basis, because generally our electricity has in the past come from turning fossil fuels into heat and turning that heat into electricity. And all of those steps have significant efficiency losses. But now that the cost of renewables have fallen so low, we can use that energy directly for heat at a lower cost than the fossil derived heat in some markets. Now, the trick here is that this solar PPA is still generating power intermittently. So it's generating based on when the sun is up. And industrial processes require generally 24/7 consistent heat input. And so there is a gap that needs to be filled by thermal energy storage to make this energy source actually useful for this application. Just looking one step further at the unit economics here, if we look at the US average natural gas price on just looking at what it costs to produce steam on a per energy unit basis, that's around $29 per megawatt hour. Now, if you just take the average US electricity cost and try to turn that into steam, it's over 2 times as much as that. So it does not make sense just to take grid electricity at the average rate and turn it into steam. But once you start looking at the value or the price of a solar PPA or the marginal cost of some of these resources, what they're actually bidding into the market, at certain times they can be significantly less than that average cost of natural gas. And we see that those costs are also much less than other kind of clean forms of heat, whether that be through renewable natural gas or through green hydrogen, looking both at the unsubsidized cost as well as the subsidized cost of hydrogen if you assume the full IRA incentives. And so how does this actually interface with the grid, and how does the actual thermal storage element play? So one thing to think about when you think about the flexibility that thermal energy storage can provide on the grid, it's different than other forms of load flexibility we've seen in the past. Traditionally, programs that look to load flexibility on the grid are talking about some sort of demand response program. And in a demand response program, we're taking an existing load and we're incentivizing it to curtail itself at times of high net demand. So this is saying the grid is strained. We need additional capacity on the grid. We are going to pay you, electricity users, to turn down during this period so that we have enough capacity on the grid. Thermal energy storage, on the other hand, is what we would call a dispatchable load. So this looks different in that it is actually being dispatched at times when net demand is low. And in its base case, it adds no new demand to times when it's high. So it will have preferably an economic incentive to be deployed at these times when there's excess generation on the grid. These might be times when there is solar or wind curtailment happening. And at these times of low price and high renewable availability, this is when this thermal energy storage wants to gobble up as much of that electricity as possible. And it wants to then be turning itself off well prior to reaching any sort of peak net demands on the system. So this offers a different paradigm and offers a number of highly valuable attributes into the system. So one, this allows for us to electrify more load and bring more load onto the system while utilizing existing system assets. So this allows for load growth without substantial overbuilds of the T&D system, because these assets will want to be drawing power at times when utilization of that grid infrastructure is low. So it allows us to amortize those system costs over a larger load base. These systems also naturally have quick response times. As Paul mentioned, these markets for these sorts of ancillary services are fairly shallow, but there are still occasions where having a load that can provide these ancillary services can still be valuable in some locations on the grid. These are also very large. We're talking gigawatt scale flexible assets. So when we're talking about needing to put gigawatts more of renewable assets on the grid, pairing that with loads that are of similar order of magnitude with flexibility allows us to more easily integrate those new renewables onto the grid. And then this is also a price responsive, or has the ability to be a highly price responsive load that can pair well with zero marginal cost resources and actually provide a price signal into the market of what load is actually willing to pay at any given point in time. And I'll show an example of this actually on the next slide. So here you can see an example of what an industrial facility like a chemical plant with thermal energy storage might look like. So this chemical plant may operate using something like 20 megawatts of electricity and something like 200 megawatts of thermal load. So this is pretty typical that something like a chemical facility will have a substantially larger thermal load than it will an electric load. And that electric load will tend to be for really core functions. And absent any sort of battery systems or traditional energy storage, it's going to need that steady 20 megawatt hours of electricity. So in a market, it is going to bid whatever it takes. It's going to bid the market cap to get its 20 megawatts of power to run the base functions of that facility. Now for the 200 megawatt of thermal power required, however, when paired with a thermal energy system, these systems can be gigawatt hours in scale, as I mentioned. This allows for that plant to bid anywhere from 0 to up to something like 700 megawatt hours into the market at any given time. So it might want to be drawing, say, 100 megawatts that it's willing to pay something like 30 megawatt hours to ensure that it can keep the thermal energy storage topped off. But then it may have another 600 megawatts that it bids at an extremely low price, something like $5 a megawatt hour, which allows it to capture in sort of these shorter bursts, these high power draws of excess renewables or very cheap power that's available on the grid, whether that's available due to congestion or curtailment or whatever it may be. These systems are designed to take advantage of those periods of low pricing on the grid and periods that we're seeing increasingly common on grids that have increasing penetrations of renewable energy. So you can see the level of flexibility here is really quite dramatic. It's going from a base load of something like 20 megawatts to then sort of an intermediate kind of draw that it wants at, say, 120 megawatts, all the way up to being able to ramp all the way up to 700 megawatts, if that's what the market dictates is most effective. So what are the kind of barriers and opportunities for thermal energy storage and heat electrification to actually participate in markets? So there's a few challenges that are keeping these systems off the grid right now. And one is interconnection bottlenecks. And these are interconnection bottlenecks both for these thermal storage assets themselves, as well as for renewables. Right now, there are actually bilateral deals happening in the market between renewable developers who aren't able to get through the interconnection process to bring their energy to market, and thermal energy storage providers and industrial heat users to just, instead of connecting that project to the grid, connect it directly to the industrial facility. Now, I think from a system perspective, this is sort of suboptimal because we would like to see all these resources be integrated into the larger market. It's the market that can help us drive efficiencies and decarbonization economy-wide. Similarly, there are also accounting protocols in some carbon markets that are also incentivizing those bilateral agreements, such as low carbon fuel standards, which force an industrial facility to use a grid average emissions factor if they're generating their heat using grid power, even if they're intentionally doing it at times when we know the marginal emissions on the grid are low. This incentive is driving towards direct connections instead of grid connections. Finally, and I think one of the biggest hurdles actually, is that many markets have unaccommodating rate structures and market participation models for these thermal energy systems. These thermal energy systems really require to have access to something that looks like the real wholesale price of electricity, rather than a retail tariff, which is going to be smooth or average, because these technologies rely on really taking advantage of those valleys in the pricing. And if they are only exposed to the average price of power, they will never actually be incentivized to dispatch, and the fossil option will generally be cheaper than the grid option under almost any circumstance, using a sort of average or even a basic time of use tariff. So the market rules are really going to dictate what stakeholders can benefit from thermal energy storage and where these thermal energy storage solutions actually get deployed. As I mentioned, one of the key factors here is access to the underlying dynamic price signals. So this would be something like the LMPs within an organized wholesale market. It also requires that we look at reducing the number of fees that get put into volumetric fees as opposed to fixed fees, because as I mentioned, these systems are very sensitive to the marginal unit cost of energy they're procuring. And so if a fixed fee is instead bundled into a volumetric fee, that will have a significant impact on the dispatch and viability of these systems. And finally, when we look at T&D charges and other demand charges, charges that are assessed on a coincident peak basis, i.e. when the whole system is at its peak demand, are charges that these systems can proactively avoid, because they ideally do not want to be dispatching at periods when the system is at its peak. However, if demand charges are assessed on a non-coincident peak, that is the specific peak power that is drawn from these systems, whether it's at a time of grid strain or not, that can really be a killer for these systems. Because as you saw in my example, if a system is ramping up to draw something like 700 megawatts, even if it's doing that in response to grid conditions that are showing that there would otherwise be curtailment or underutilization on the grid, if they are assessed a peak demand charge at that time, that is not going to make for a viable project. So what I will leave this audience with is that this technology is arriving, and in some cases already here. So there's a lot of public and private in these solutions. As I mentioned, I'm working directly with Rondo Energy. This slide is showing a picture of their demonstration facility in California at an ethanol refiner. And we're seeing a lot of ramping up going on with industrial customers who really want access to this sort of solution. So I really look forward to talking with this group more in the breakouts. And I will be happy to take your questions, your overarching questions with the remainder of the group here, and then your specific questions in the breakout. So thank you everyone for attending and for your time.
Thank you so much, Max. That was a great overview of thermal, industrial electrification and thermal energy storage, and tease us up to some of the market questions that Nikita is also going to be talking about in her talk. So I'm going to ask Nikita to share her slides and talk about market design considerations and also what happened in CalISO in 2022. Take it away, Nikita.
Thank you, Debbie. Can you confirm that you can see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes, it's perfect.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. So today I'll be giving you a brief overview about Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Order number 841, which was very significant in enhancing the participation of storage resources in wholesale electricity markets. And then I'll follow that with about two specific aspects to do with electric storage resources. One is participation models. I know Max briefly touched upon that, so that's great that it's a nice introduction to this subtopic. And then I'll be introducing you to ways in which we could manage the state of charge of these new resource types that we are beginning to see on the grid. And then I'll follow that up with some recent experiences with how storage performed during extreme weather conditions, especially with what happened in California ISO last year in September during the heat wave. Now, to start off with FERC order number 841, now this was a huge order that was passed in February of 2018, wherein FERC required that all the ISOs and RTOs in the United States include a participation model for electric storage resources, and to allow them to participate in energy, ancillary services, and capacity markets when they're technically capable of doing so. I will talk about what a participation model means, but it is important to have a participation model in place for new technologies, especially when you start to see significant penetration of these technologies into the grid. I won't go into all the other requirements of the order, but the one key requirement that was significant was the fact that ISOs were required to allow for asset owners to self-manage the state of charge of the assets. And essentially, the ISOs should not solely be controlling the resource, so they shouldn't be operating the resource themselves, but rather also provide the developers with the flexibility to manage the state of charge of their own resource. Now, what does a participation model mean? The notice of proposed rule making basically defined a participation model as a set of tariff provisions that accommodate the participation of resources with particular physical and operating characteristics within these wholesale electricity markets. It takes a lot to represent these physical and operating characteristics of specific resources within market clearing software. So we also mentioned that participation model includes a set of market clearing provisions, market clearing software provisions that are required to represent these characteristics. So essentially, a participation model characteristics can include anything that would require change in the market clearing software to integrate a new technology. It can also include what kind of bidding parameters may be needed by a resource to interface with the market, what services are they eligible to provide, and how can we model those service provisions within the market clearing software. Now, anytime a new technology begins to participate in wholesale electricity markets, there may be a need to introduce a new participation model, but it comes at a significant cost because this requires a lot of stakeholder meetings and also changes to the market clearing software that requires cost, right? There is the option to modify existing participation models, but that may be inefficient because you may be trying to fit a particular resource into a participation model that may be meant for a different resource type. So you may not accurately capture the efficient features of this particular technology. However, it does have the benefit of being easy to implement and it's already understood. There is always a trade-off in understanding whether or not there is a need for a new participation model. Are we seeing significant penetration of a resource that it deems it important to introduce a new model? As a consequence of FERC order number 841, pretty much all the ISOs in the United States introduced new participation models for storage resources. And when I say storage here, let's talk about batteries. What happened is that there are two kinds of storage technologies that we're predominantly seeing in the United States, right? Like one is batteries and the other one is pump storage hydro resources. With batteries, they can operate seamlessly in a continuous manner from maximum charging to maximum discharging. They don't have any discontinuities essentially. Whereas a pump storage hydro resource has certain constraints in that it can only operate at a certain minimum charging level. The pumps can charge at a specific point, and discharge as well. The turbines can discharge at a specific point. They have minimum constraints. So these introduce non-convexities into the market. So essentially what happened is most of the ISOs introduced two separate participation models, one for batteries, which is a continuous participation model, and the other for pump storage hydro resources. I won't get into the details of what they call these participation models, but feel free to refer to this slide once you get a chance to. Now, switching gears to the state of charge management of this specific technology, given that energy storage resources are energy limited, there has to be a lot of thought that has to be goes behind how the state of charge of these resources can be managed. There are 4 different ways in which the state of charge of these technologies could be managed. One is self-scheduling the batteries, or the asset owners could manage their own state of charge. So that's referred to as the self-state of charge management. And then the last two on the right side are state of charge management light and ISO state of charge management. This is essentially, these two features are when the ISOs are themselves managing the state of charge of these resources and the asset owners are not managing the state of charge. The difference between these two options is essentially in the way the market clearing software is designed. In state of charge management light, what happens is some ISOs are using a sequential design for clearing, security constrained economic dispatch programs, as a result of which they solve the problem of optimizing these assets on an interval by interval basis in a sequential manner. Whereas a subset of the ISOs solve the problem in using multi-interval optimization problems, which is more efficient. Because you get a chance to look at multiple intervals in a single snapshot, right? So that's referred to as the ISO state of charge management. So essentially, when you go from the leftmost option to the rightmost options, what happens is the scheduling responsibility increases for the ISO, but theoretically, the economic efficiency and the reliability benefits also increase. On the other hand, what would happen is you would increase the complexity of the market clearing software, so it does get computationally challenging to solve the ISO state of charge management option. As you go from the rightmost option to the leftmost option, it does give the storage asset owners more flexibility in the way that they could offer into the market, but it does increase their responsibility, because now the asset owners would be responsible in ensuring that the state of charge is feasible to begin with. It also means that if you were to go to the leftmost option, the computational efficiency is obviously bound to increase, because now you don't need to model complex state of charge constraints within the market clearing software, right? And the onus is on the developers to manage their own state of charge, as a result of which the computational efficiency of the market clearing software could increase. We did a study to understand which of these options may, how would these options impact the theoretical economic efficiency and reliability benefits for a test case system, to better understand what role the state of charge management option may play. On the left, I'm going to briefly go over the results from that study. On the left chart, the results have been shown for a penetration scenario that had low renewables and low penetration of batteries as well. Whereas on the right side, the chart shows a high renewable scenario. The first bar graph shows the operating costs that were obtained from the system without any storage. And then the same sequence as the previous slide has been maintained, wherein the second graph shows the self-state of charge management costs. The option where you're sequentially solving the market is the third bar chart, and then the fourth bar is the ISO state of charge management, where you're doing a multi-interval optimization. So one thing to note is that the lower the cost, the better it is for the system, right? So you can see that the ISO state of charge management option results in the least operating costs. So it was found to be economically the most efficient option. It did also result in the highest profits for these assets. So when it comes to thinking about it from the assets perspective, their revenue also would be higher with the ISO state of charge management option. whereas the self state of charge management option, in fact, resulted in increasing the cost. You would think about, why did this happen? Well, when the asset owners are participating in the market using offers, it may be the case that they may not actually clear at a point that they anticipated to clear, and the state of charge in real time may not be exactly what they wanted it to be. And as a result of which, the schedules may look totally different, right, in real time when compared to day ahead. What happens is then the system operators are forced to rely on some expensive units that come online in the last minute, and that increases the cost as well. So essentially, this is important because the way you operate an electric storage resource and how these resources participate in the market can have a significant impact in the magnitude of benefits that we can obtain from these technologies. And the same results were also seen in the high renewable case, but I won't get into the details of that. Now, there is one specific aspect with these technologies. So I think Paul kind of gave a nice introduction about how 4-hour batteries are what we are beginning to see, right? And it's enough to clip the peak demand. But there is a big issue when it comes to market clearing software design. And this is because of the fact that we solve multiple markets on multiple timescales. We solve a day ahead market for, let's say for tomorrow, you solve a day ahead market today. And in real time, you then solve another market because you have better forecast accuracy in real time, right? So you update the forecast and then you resolve the market in near real time. And day ahead is just a means of kind of making sure that you have your long start units, which have like longer minimum up or down time constraints, or a startup notification, they can be started up in advance of the real time market. So the fact that we're using these multiple time scales to solve the market can complicate the state of charge management of these new technologies, particularly more so because in the day ahead market, you can solve this. Basically, the day ahead market solves the entire day in a single shot, right? It solves 24 hourly intervals, whereas the real time market, the majority of the ISOs only look, maybe the maximum that they look at is 3 hours ahead. What I've shown here is the real-time unit commitment market, where on the bottom left, you can see that the market is looking at the 3-hour horizon with 15-minute intervals, or 12, 15-minute intervals, whereas the day-ahead market is solving 24 intervals at the same time. So now the issue comes with, you may land up in a situation where you start to see high prices early in the day and discharge your asset because you are short-sighted and you cannot see what's going to happen later in the day. As a result of this, you may empty out your battery too early in the day, and you may land up in a situation where you cannot use these resources adequately later in the day when the system conditions are stressed. And this is something that played a very important role in the recent stressed event that we had seen in California ISO. I just wanted to give you a teaser for what this issue is through this particular slide, but let's get into what happened in California ISO and how did storage perform during the extreme weather condition that we witnessed in September 2022. As many of you may already know, California ISO experienced record-breaking summer weather conditions last year in September. In fact, they had an all-time high new record load of 52,000 megawatts. In the past, it had only hit a peak of about 50,000 megawatts. Despite the extreme conditions that California ISO witnessed, they managed to avert the need for rotating outages. And a lot of moving gears kind of helped the grid work through in a seamless manner in that stress time frame. For instance, there was numerous flex alerts that were issued by California ISO that were very helpful. In fact, there were energy conservation efforts through the government which resulted in demand reduction of about 1,500 megawatts. But the one key aspect that we would like to focus on in the next 10 minutes is on how the role that storage played. These storage resources are essentially the storage resources that also cleared to provide capacity in the resource adequacy construct that is existent in CAISO. Note that CAISO is leading the country with the penetration of storage resources. Currently, at the end of 2022, they had about 3 gigawatts of storage, and this is standalone storage resources. And they had about 2 gigawatts of storage paired with a co-located renewable resource, which is also referred to as hybrid or co-located resources. There's a lot on this slide, but let me walk you through it. Different aspects of the challenges that operators had to face with operating these resources. And I'd like to point out to the fact that the numbers are what I would like you to focus on when so let's start with the number one challenge. Anytime you solve a market or an optimization, you need to have some sort of initial conditions, right, to initialize and then solve the market. So in the day ahead market, let's say you're running the day ahead market for tomorrow today, and these markets are run typically at 10 a.m. today for tomorrow, or by noon, maybe it depends on which market you are in. So you have to estimate what the initial condition of these storage resources would be at midnight tonight, so that you can run the day ahead market. Given that these resources are just 4-hour duration, a lot can happen between now to midnight, that what you anticipate that the storage's state of charge would be at midnight, it may not be the case. Why would it not be the case? Well, in real time, typically you experience stress conditions because of which there's a lot of price volatility, as a result of which storage may deviate in response to that volatility. In fact, one of the main reasons to use storage is to provide that flexibility when you see any unanticipated conditions from wind or solar, for instance, as a result of which your initial parameter setting for state of charge itself may be wholly off. And that is exactly what you saw on September 5th. The leftmost chart on the top basically signifies the total state of charge of all the storage resources on CAISO's grid. So you can see it is about 12, it goes as high as 12,000 megawatt hours. So these are 4-hour durations and 3,000 megawatts of standalone battery. The blue chart shows the state of charge. The blue plot shows the state of charge of the aggregate storage resources in real time, whereas the black one shows the result that you anticipated from the day ahead. You can see that in the first interval itself, there's a significant difference in what the initial state of charge parameter setting was. What happens is, if you're way off in the way you initialize your solution, there is some information that is exchanged from day ahead to real time, and that information may be also off as a result. So that can create significant challenges. Now, going into number two, which is to do with challenges of managing the state of charge of these assets in real time. As I mentioned earlier, real time is myopic in its view, right? It only solves, in fact, real time economic dispatch, and majority of the ISOs are just 10 minutes long. California ISO and New York ISO are the only two ISOs actually that look at the next hour, right? So what happens is that, given, for instance, September 6th, the day when you witnessed the new record-breaking peak, the prices landed up being extremely high. Quite early in the day, way before 4 o'clock. You can see that about 1 o'clock. So the bottom chart, the blue, is what shows the prices. So as you can see that the prices started to increase quite early in the day, around 1 o'clock, and they started peaking way in advance of the stress system conditions as well. Well, this was an unusual day where you were observing peak prices, scarcity prices, as a result of which, given that the real-time horizon is limited in its view, you see high prices, you want to discharge your battery, right? You want to make money. So you can see that the blue chart, which signifies the discharge schedule of the storage assets, is significantly different than the black chart in day ahead, where batteries started to discharge really early in the day. Well, at some point, what happened is the operators forced them to stay idle, and you can see this sudden drop where the batteries come back down to 0 and then start discharging again during the peak conditions. This particular, profile of, hey, start discharging, now stay idle, then discharge again, created a lot of speculation amongst the developers as to what's happening. But in reality, at the back end, the market performed exactly like it was designed to. The operators knew that there are stress conditions in the next after an hour or two, which will require that state of charge. So the instruction was to hold that state of charge. 1 hour later, there are going to be more dire conditions, and we're going to run into an issue there if you don't hold it. So that's exactly why they were pushed back down to stay idle. If you focus on number 4, which shows the state of charge, essentially California ISO has this neat feature called the minimum state of charge requirement. They essentially have this tool wherein they use the information that they've obtained from day ahead, which looks at multiple intervals on an entire day, to understand that there may be a peak condition later in the day. So they use that information to set a lower bound on the state of charge requirement in real time. because they have to do that because otherwise the batteries would, discharge prematurely quite early in the day. And you can see that on September 6th, when you saw this weird dispatch profile, you can see that the state of charge and day ahead and real time were really close to each other. Essentially, this was the lower bound constraint that was kicking in, and it beautifully performed to kind of hold back the state of charge and then discharge later in the day. I think the other issue was to do with just merit order dispatch. The prices were so high. Batteries were also experiencing the opportunity to bid in scarcity conditions. So, they're not as used to what should the bids look like. So a bid to kind of discharge that may appear to be quite high may not be high enough under scarcity conditions, right? Because now the new market clearing price that was being witnessed was about $2,000 per megawatt hour. So what happened is that some of these discharge bids landed up being economical, and as a result of which they started discharging quite early in the day. Another challenge is that some of these storage assets were, situated in congestion, in locations where there was a lot of congestion. Given that these locations had some congestion-related issues, they were flagged to be mitigated for potential gaming concerns, for instance, right? So when a resource is mitigated, their bids are changed and lowered down to certain reference bids. This again adds further complexities because if their bids are modified to reference bids, they will now clear the market because they're not, the operators are not using the original bids because of market power issues. These are 4 different angles to what all happened during that event. But at the end of that event, I mean, the performance was quite, it's commendable to basically see that the different the design features that were included actually performed as they were anticipated to perform.
Nikita, you've got 4 more minutes.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, this is my last slide actually, so that's a good thing. I'll probably touch base on a couple more points, and if you have more questions or interested in what else happened, please feel free to come to the breakout room. Number 5 is to do with the horizon length of real-time dispatch. California ISO and New York ISO are 2 ISOs that actually solve a multi-interval optimization in the real-time market, and they have a horizon as long as 1 hour. So essentially they solve 10 5-minute intervals. It's about 50 minutes, not 1 hour. In this real-time dispatch, the first interval is the binding interval, and everything else following that is advisory. And then the ISO also rolls the real-time dispatches forward by every 5 minutes. So it has a rolling horizon of 5 minutes. In this Excel spreadsheet snapshot, what you're seeing are the different real-time dispatch runs in the different columns, and the hour and the interval number in that hour are also indicated on the left. You can see, first of all, that the green were the binding instructions that were issued to the storage asset owners. The ISO is saying in the first RTD run that, discharge 161 megawatt storage accurately followed it. The topmost row signifies the actual telemetered value of storage production levels. So storage was actually following it beautifully. But come stress conditions as the horizon rolled forward, the ISO issued instructions to stay idle. But storage was not following that instruction. Essentially, they were still continuing to discharge because they were seeing high prices. So they thought it would be beneficial for them to discharge. So let's keep discharging because we could make money. And at one point, which is hour 17, interval 5, that's the, if you see, look at RTD 6, that column, that was the last interval, just after that, when you go into RTD 7 is when the real time was able to see the minimum state of charge constraint that kicked in, as a result of which the instruction was to discharge. Before that, the instruction was to charge. Before that, all the other intervals, the instruction was to discharge. And it's essentially, that's the interval when the real-time horizon was able to see that there is the stress condition forthcoming. So now let me just keep charging. So I have enough state of charge for the stress system conditions. Another important point to note here is that the horizon length of the real-time dispatch is dynamic. It changes. Sometimes it has 10 intervals, sometimes it has 9 intervals, sometimes it has 7 intervals. What would be beneficial would be to have a real-time, dispatch with a longer look-ahead horizon so that you can anticipate the stress system conditions later in the day. But there are computational complexity issues with that, right? There's a reason why they're not able to solve a real-time dispatch which has a longer look ahead. We have some ideas on what else could be done, which we're thinking of also summarizing in a publicly available report that is going to come out soon on just the analysis of this event and some suggested potential solutions. And with that, I think I'll wrap this up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nikita. That was a great deep dive into the different considerations of market rules and market participation models and how storage fits. We are now going to take a 5-minute bio break, and then we're going to come back with Mark Ahlstrom from NextEra Energy Resources, who's going to talk about hybrid resources and participation of hybrids in the market. So 5-minute bio break until 2:23. Thanks.
Batteries and things like this. So the ITO can lead us to a quote optimal solution, but only at the cost of increasing complexity and computational load, particularly when we think farther out in terms of farther look aheads, like Nikita was just mentioning. If we really want to deal with optimal system operations, it gets extremely complicated, even with a relatively small number of storage and more complicated resources. But once we start looking at maybe tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of these participating resources in the future, will that actually be a sustainable approach? So in a sense, I'm going to be showing you an argument at a higher level, more of a architecture approach about, is there actually an argument essentially for non-optimality as being the logical solution? And I'll explain that and why this is something I've been talking about. The concept of hybrids, by the way, is it's not new, but we really dove in and started talking about this at more detail only about 4 years ago, 2019. And then, as I'll show you here, there's been a lot of work since that time. But this is, conceptually a different way of looking at the market operations of tomorrow. So let me advance this. First of all, let's talk about what am I talking about with a hybrid resource source versus a co-located resource. Option A just says that, look, we're increasingly seeing arguments about why we want to combine things together behind the point of interconnection with the bulk power system. The classic example that Paul also discussed was we're combining like PV solar with lithium-ion battery storage. And we actually want to perhaps put that behind the same step-up transformer, a single point of interconnection with the grid, right? And that makes a lot of sense. There's lots of reasons. There's been lots of work on this. I point just a couple of references. There's been a lot of great material you can find at the ESIG link. That was a Unlocking Flexibility of Hybrid Resources task force last year. And also in 2020, this had already resulted in a major FERC technical conference. And you can go to that link and see a testimony that I put in that discussed some of these concepts I'm talking about today, along with dozens of other input that was submitted as part of the hybrid technical conferences at FERC. So co-located, is kind of a logical thing. But there's also this concept of hybrid. And okay, what's the difference? Electrically, they're identical. The interconnection between this energy factory, this hybrid or co-located resource, and the transmission system or the distribution system is, in most cases, absolutely identical. The difference is in the participation model about how does it interact with the market or the grid management control software. Is it going to be treated as two separate, traditional kind of technologies, two separate power plants as an option A in a co-located approach? Or is that going to be actually viewed as a single resource, a sort of black box that is not exactly either one of the underlying technologies, or could be a whole set of different technologies inside that black box, but is willing to essentially continue to interact with the market through markets, through performance penalties, if it fails to perform and so forth. But it's up to the owner operator of that hybrid plant to do all the analytics and optimization about how it wants to do that, right? So most, Nikita also pointed out that in many cases, it's if you look at the numbers, and EPRI has done some additional very good research on this. Under the current market rules, the way that we run things now, and the way we treat variable renewables, which often are allowed to generate freely most of the time, without having to be penalized maybe for failure to follow the dispatch instructions so closely. And most of the time under these rules right now, the co-located resource tends to pencil out as the more cost-effective option, the more profitable option. But as we'll see, that might change in the future because, as was also pointed out in additional EPRI work that we could show you, there is increasing concern about the computational complexity and just the overall complexity of the ISO RTO, whether that's what they ought to be focusing on in the future. So that's the difference. Is co-located and hybrid can be exactly the same hardware system and all that. It's just really how do you look at it from a participation model point of view. So this philosophy is really that if you're doing a hybrid as a single resource, it's really looking more like an intelligent agent for a system of technologies that offers this energy and services at the point of interconnection, the PUI, really just like, in a sense, a more ideal conventional resource, but with more flexibility and fewer constraints because of its use of energy storage, power electronics, and software, right? It becomes a more ideal resource in the sense that you probably don't have to worry about startup times or ramp rates. It's got so much flexibility, and you can control this software any way you want to really, provide these services. Said another way, I've generalized this often before. I say, you give me enough energy, storage, electronics, and software, we can emulate any kind of electrical machine you want to see at that point of interconnection, right? What exactly do you want it to do? Julia's going to talk about this in another sense, and really more the hardware interconnection about how we can use this flexibility. Very important topic, but that's dealing with a really fast interface with the grid and what happens during disturbances and so forth. I'm talking here that I can also do this at the larger market participation model type approach about how we actually philosophically look at resources in the future. Now, the other thing that's happening that's really driving this are things like, I think Paul alluded to some of this too, in a sense, when we start combining storage and PV, we see this very quickly, that in almost all of these new types of inverter-based power plants in particular, we're actually overbuilding the capability inside of the plants already. Anybody building like a 100 megawatt utility scale PV plant, just PV alone, it might be 100 megawatts at the, from the point of the grid interconnection, the injection limit, the max you can inject into the grid is 100 megawatts, but you're likely to have maybe 140 megawatts of PV panels behind that inverter inside the plant. And this is just a consequence of the optimization, that because you can stretch out the shoulders and get a higher capacity factor for the plant, and because PV panels themselves are actually the cheap part of the plant these days, you're going to put in extra generation inside this thing essentially. And then you can control it with the inverter so you don't exceed the injection limit at any point, right? Similarly, if you have a hybrid of PV plus storage, not only are you overbuilding the PV in that way, but now you're adding maybe another 50 megawatts of lithium-ion storage. So you might end up with 140 megawatts of PV panels and 50 megawatts of storage. You actually are a 190 megawatt plant that is just controlling everything to be a 100 megawatt plant at the point of interconnection, right? Lots of reasons why this makes economic and design sense. And I would argue that for almost any hybrid, including the load hybrids that Max was talking about, which I'll come back to, the internal megawatts will exceed the grid interface that you need at the point of interconnection, sometimes by a lot. And we're likely to see more of this, as I'll talk about in a moment, about hydrogen plants and things like that. Fundamentally, it's this interconnection cost that is becoming the limiting factor for a lot of this. So you want to use that interconnection as efficiently as possible, because it takes a lot of time to get through the interconnection queue. It takes a lot of money to do the interconnection upgrades. And it's just a very scarce commodity to get enough interconnections. So that is what you want to optimize. So let's dive just a bit more into these strange combinations of people, these chimeras, if you like, about putting all this stuff together in strange ways. Here I'm adding a couple other options that came out of also out of EPRI work. And this is similar to what Nikita was talking about with the battery storage optimization. The problem with option A is that you have more than 100 megawatts of PV plus storage. Therefore, somebody has to coordinate to make sure you don't exceed the injection limit. So there has to be some coordination between these two, quote, separate resources. They're still having to be coordinated. So should that be done, an option, like an option D here, actually, by saying that there's going to be more information about that, right? In a sense that, do I give all that telemetry to the system operator and let them coordinate that constraint at the point of interconnection, or is that done in some other way? And similarly, in option C here, we're really saying who should deal with the infeasible dispatch that could result, if you clear me for certain features and I can't actually simultaneously do those from these two pieces because you've over dispatched me in a sense, and things like this. It gets very complicated. I won't go into details here. But the question is, who should take on that problem, right? Should it be the system operator that adds even more complexity to do this? Or should it be the hybrid operator that uses its analytics and does it more in a offer of services and penalties for failure to perform optimization with its own analytics? So here's what really drives my thought on this and why I've spent a lot of time on this on the last 4 years is that I'm getting old. I've seen a lot of stuff. I was in software industry for, over 20 years before I got into energy by accident, actually. So yes, if we want to do an optimal solution, as we found with software, we could do it by just writing a continuous monolithic top-down program that just squeezes everything possible out of the hardware, right? But it didn't take software long to figure out that these machines we're creating with software were rapidly, exponentially getting more and more complicated. So we had to deal with this complexity, right? So how do we deal with this complexity? System architecture became important. And the way that software did this was to say, look, I'm not going to just write a continuous stream of low-level code to optimize this stuff. It's just not worth it anymore. I'm going to organize into subroutines, and that moved into object-oriented programming where you would have separate objects that did different functions. And that's gone all the way now to service level interfaces and intelligent cooperating agents where you say, look, this is your energy factory over here. I don't care how you do it inside your walls. I just care about how it interfaces with me and provides the grid services and energy dispatch that I need, right? Make it somebody else's problem. That's really what we're doing here, is saying that the RTO doesn't have to be the only intelligent one here that's going to optimize my iron for me. Maybe market participants should be willing and able to take that on themselves and be responsible for that. Now, that also provides all kinds of opportunities for ongoing innovation, enhancement, upgrades when, inside that factory wall that I think is extremely important because we're seeing an exponential growth in the pace of innovation as well. So this is basically the concept of moving toward a much more high-level type of participation model. So in general, what we're saying here is that we got to think about whose problem is this. Do we really want to control all the internal details of every resource? I would argue that we're reaching the point where that's just not going to work. By focusing on services performance, we actually can build a more reliable, maintainable system, even in the face of exponential increase in complexity in participants. This is looking a lot like, as you probably guessed, the web, the internet. Where you have lots of smart agents that are cooperating under certain rules, but I don't have to care about how you do that inside your own object. So what is the best role for the system operator? How much complexity should they be worrying about versus just dealing with the balancing reliability of the system at a higher level. And can we keep up with the new capabilities? The problem we're starting to see is that it's not easy to change the grid management and market software. Often takes multiple years to get a new feature in. We have this huge backlog right now in adding new market participation models and more sophisticated battery management, for example, into the software. How can that possibly keep up with an exponential rate of growth in technology? And so last slide here is, this is only going to get worse, right? As Max pointed out, a good example of his industrial loads, we're seeing massive load expansion. Green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, even carbon capture is actually going to increase the load that we need dramatically. Some of these green hydrogen plants could be gigawatt electrolyzers and maybe 4 gigawatts of PV panels and some batteries, all behind my point of interconnection as the way I might like to do it. And that, as Max pointed out, increasingly wants us to make these combinations of load and energy look more like wholesale market participants, a little more like generators in a sense, rather than a load, right? Carbon capture, if we can keep some of the thermal plants running and do full carbon capture, that's great. It's going to take a lot of energy to do that. So these plants that were, a 500 megawatt coal or gas plant now only have, maybe 2/3 of that to actually inject to the grid because they need a big chunk of that for the energy needed for carbon capture and storage. They just created surplus generation. Why would I not want to start putting PV or other technologies in there and run that more as a hybrid to maximize the interconnection as well? In fact, ERCOT's been looking at this sort of stuff. They're seeing, they just started looking for these, what they call large flexible loads. They found tens of gigawatts of these loads that want to connect that they didn't know about yet, that want to connect within a few years. Certainly stuff like crypto and data centers and the AI, the data center load is growing dramatically with all this AI stuff going on right now. But also green hydrogen, LNG, even electrification of pumps and oil fields is driving huge load growth down there. And then long duration storage, really interesting to me. I think we don't really realize just how we're going to use this stuff. It's going to be interesting. A lot of that's going to want to be hybridized into these other combinations so that we can really do that, maybe in advance of having the ideal participation model. So the transmission, the challenges continue. Transmission, still a big issue for all this stuff. Interconnection complexity actually drives some of this push toward hybridization. As Max also pointed out, I think, there's a real risk of grid defection of these gigantic industrial sites, including green hydrogen. That would be a shame for the grid, for the reliability of the grid in the long run. But we have to figure that out because we want to keep them interconnected to the grid, but we can't make it too onerous for them to do that. And then as I pointed out, it's becoming very difficult to update the legacy software that we're running our markets and our grid on. This is becoming a threat to reliability, really, that we can't take advantage of the new features. And it's only going to get worse with exponential growth of innovation, number of participants, and system complexity. So we really have to look at ways of doing what software did all the way back in the 80s, of saying we need to move to a different architecture to be able to deal with this. So thanks. I'd be happy to take questions with the group, and I look forward to the breakout.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was a great forward-thinking philosophical consideration of how the architecture of the future power system might take place. We're going to have another forward-looking discussion that Dr. Julia Matavosian from ESIG is going to discuss grid-forming battery storage. So this is a potential way to future-proof power systems as we have higher penetrations of inverters on the system and start running into stability challenges. Julia?
All right, Debbie, can you see my screen?
I can see it and I can hear you fine. Thank you.
All right, great. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I'll continue talking about battery storage and a little bit of a futuristic look into what services batteries can provide in the short term. So just to level set, to introduce some of the stability challenges and issues that we are seeing with inverter-based resources. And by inverter-based resources, I mean solar, wind, and storage. So resources that use power electronics in the interface with the grid. So this chart here is from NREL, and the illustration is from about end of 2021, though I updated data for Ireland and ERCOT. So what you're seeing here in gray circles is energy percentage that is provided by wind and solar on annual basis in each of the systems. And you can see system size on x-axis and percentage of wind and solar on y-axis. And then the red circles are showing percentage of instantaneous penetration of wind and solar. So basically instantaneous load that is being served by wind and solar generation at any given time. And so you can see here that some of the small systems, they are already now reaching 100% of instantaneous share of inverter-based resources. Whereas some of the medium systems, they are already getting pretty high as well. So say systems like Crete or Ireland, which is also a big island system, reaching as high as 75%. I want to mention that in Ireland, actually higher percentage would have been possible, but for operational constraints reasons, Irish system operator is limiting it at 75%. Last year in April, ERCOT actually reached 71%. So basically, during shoulder time in spring, in the beginning of the day, when sun started rising already, so they got some solar penetration and wind was really high, they got to 71%. So we're getting into this high numbers, and we're starting to see some new operational challenges. So in this first challenge stems, or basically both of those challenges actually stem from the fact that most of the inverters today, wind, solar, and storage inverters, they are so-called grid following. So what they do, they read a signal, voltage and frequency from the grid, and they lock onto that and they inject power into the grid, which is aligned with the signal that they read. So basically they use grid as a reference. And the signal comes from traditional synchronous generators. So think coal-fired, gas-fired, hydro generation that we have today. And so the further the wind and solar generation pockets are from synchronous generation areas, the weaker the grid. And then if the grid is weak, then the signal that inverter-based resources are using as a reference is easily perturbed as these resources are injecting power into the grid. And so it may be hard for inverters to lock on the system correctly. And this may lead to instability challenges. And so this is illustrated on the right-hand side with an example of ERCOT. So ERCOT in the west side of the grid has a very good resource for wind and solar generation. And so currently already gigawatts of wind and solar generation are installed in this area. But on the other hand, traditionally load in this area was very low. And so there is basically no synchronous generation, so no thermal conventional generation is in this area. And most of this generation is actually where the load centers are, so in the east part of the state. And so what happens here is because these pockets of wind and solar generation are far away from the strong generation source, the grid here is weak, and it's hard for this inverter-based resources to lock onto the signal that comes from this traditional synchronous generators. And what you can see on the bottom plot here is that as those inverter-based resources are actually trying to control voltage in the area where they are connected, they're kind of fighting each other, and that results in instability in voltage. And that was actual event that happened in ERCOT as far away as 2012. Another issue is, and you might have heard, is a problem with synchronous inertia. So following resource trip, so generator trip, an initial rate of change of frequency is solely a function of synchronous inertia on the system. And today, this inertia is provided by synchronous machines And so with increasing shares of inverter-based resources, there can be periods when the synchronous inertia on the system is low, because there is less synchronous generation available because some of the generators retired or they are not committed at the time. So they're not online and providing inertia. And so what you can see on the bottom chart here is just very initial change of frequency in the first second after a generator trips. So the chart is actually from ERCOT actual event. So if you are at 60 Hertz and a generator somewhere on the system trips, the frequency starts deviating from the 60 Hertz. And if inertia is low, then this deviation is fast and frequency declines much faster. And if inertia is high, then frequency declines slower. And why is it important? Because it determines time that any kind of frequency control, frequency response mechanisms have to respond to this frequency decline. And if this time is insufficient, then frequency decline is too fast and it can trip under frequency load shedding. So basically involuntary load shedding may happen if frequency decline is too quick. So that's where the problem is. So as I mentioned, traditional inverter-based resources, wind, solar storage that we have installed on the systems today, they are grid following, and they are not contributing to system inertia or providing system strengths. They also display synchronous generation in the dispatch or in unit commitment, and that may exacerbate weak grid and inertia issues because then there is less synchronous generation online that traditionally have provided some of these services. Additionally, as I mentioned, grid following inverter-based resources, they require sufficient system strengths to operate stably, and they also require sufficient inertia if they are providing any kind of frequency response. So basically to be able to measure frequency change and provide frequency response service. So possible operating issues with high share of this type of inverter-based resources is that we get into deeper frequency deviation after generator trip events because inertia is getting lower. There can be control interactions between inverters in areas with low system strengths. There can be issues with resources riding through system faults because of reduced system strengths. There can be protection issues because it becomes hard to detect that there is a fault happening on the grid, and also diminishing black start capability because synchronous generators traditionally are providing black start service to the grid, and as they are retiring, they maybe become lesser pool of black start resources that operators can rely on. So all of this is to say these issues are happening with really high shares of inverter-based resources. So as we're getting into, say, 60–70% of penetration of inverter-based resources on a system, this is when these issues are becoming kind of obvious and harder to mitigate. And at lower shares of inverter-based resources, they can still provide some of the services that synchronous generators are providing today, and there may be no issues yet. So basically, because of all these issues that happen at high shares of inverter-based resources, there is a limit of how much grid following inverter-based resources can be accommodated on the grid. And this is primarily due to system strengths concerns and inertia concerns. And so as a result, system operators, they may limit output of inverter-based resources and supply remaining load by synchronous generators just to make sure that there is sufficient system strengths and sufficient inertia available on the grid. And this is already kind of common practice in power systems that are facing high shares of inverter-based resources, such as Australia, Ireland, and state of Texas. And such operational constraints in the long run, they result in curtailment because, if you need to limit output from inverter-based resources, then they cannot produce their full power. And that can impede further development of this cheap, clean energy source. Alternatively, there are other measures to mitigate weak grid and inertia issues, and supplemental equipment can be added to the grid. But it results in additional costs, and the benefits of this equipment need to be carefully evaluated. On the other side, there is a new, relatively new type of control that is possible on inverter-based resources. It's so-called grid forming, and it's gaining interest in the recent years. Grid forming inverters, they can create their own voltage and frequency signal if they operate in an island, or they can operate in coordination with other grid forming resources and support stability of the interconnected grid, kind of in a similar manner as synchronous generators are doing today. So this is very helpful and flexible type of control, which within capability of hardware can provide some of the valuable functions that synchronous generators are providing to the grid today. So this grid forming controls, they can potentially be implemented on any type of inverter-based resource, be it wind or solar. However, grid forming behavior requires a certain amount of energy buffer. So this energy needs to be readily available to nearly instantaneously be injected into the grid when needed. For wind and solar resources, that means that they continuously will need to operate between the max or below the maximum available power production. So basically, they need to always have some margin to be able to quickly inject power into the grid as needed. And that means that there is a lost opportunity because they cannot use this energy all the time and sell an energy market. In addition, grid forming control in wind turbines, it may result in a greater and more frequent mechanical stress, because wind turbines, they have still some rotating mechanical parts, and that needs to be considered when implementing grid forming controls. It's not to say it's impossible, but it's just more complicated. Whereas in a battery, there is already an energy buffer. That's what battery actually is. And so only software modifications to battery controls are needed to make battery grid forming resource. And so that makes batteries really a low-hanging fruit for grid forming application. You may say, well, if it's just software upgrades, why don't we continue installing batteries as we do today as grid following controls, and then convert them later to grid forming when the need becomes more apparent? And that's a fair question and a fair thing to consider, but retrofitting existing grid following batteries into grid forming controls, even though it's just a software, still potentially brings additional costs and delays because it requires model updates, restudies, and changes to various contractual agreements. So this option needs to be kind of carefully evaluated against the option of going for grid forming batteries upfront already now. So not only battery is a low-hanging fruit for application of grid forming controls, we also currently have finding ourselves in a unique window of opportunity to deploy grid forming capability on batteries. And why is that? So if you look at the left-hand side, this is a chart from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, queued up research, where they're looking at kind of state of interconnection queues over the years. And so this right part is showing interconnection queue in 2022. And you can see that there is nearly 700 gigawatts of storage currently waiting in the interconnection queue. Some of it is standalone storage. I showed this in light blue color. And this darker blue color is showing storage that will be, there's planned to be co-located with primarily solar, that what Mark was just talking about for hybrids. And so in the absence of any incentives or requirements for the storage to be grid forming, it will all be built as grid following. And so we may miss this window of opportunity of building gigawatts of inverter-based resources that can actually support the grid rather than kind of eat into grids stability margins. And so we put on the right-hand side, you see two reports that we put together. These are decision maker briefs talking about benefits of making batteries and grid forming right away and kind of deploying this technology already today. And so on the left-hand side, this is more general decision maker brief, while on the right-hand side, this one is focused on ERCOT system and using it as an example. And so I'll go through some of these examples using our ERCOT system to kind of clarify what are the benefits of deploying grid forming capability already today. So again, on the left-hand side, I have this cartoon of our ERCOT system with a lot of inverter-based resources in the west side. So as I mentioned, this is now a weak grid area. So what ERCOT is having to do to maintain stability in this area, they have to limit output on these resources during some system conditions to maintain stability. And so the way ERCOT is doing it is by introducing constraints on export on transmission lines exporting from these areas of weak grid concerns. And so what it does that in the real-time economic dispatch, the real-time economic dispatch sees it as a transmission constraint, and it dispatches generation behind this constraint down. So basically, this is just a method to implement curtailment through real-time security constrained economic dispatch. So over time, the number of these constraints is growing. So here, what you can see in the middle plot is a number of these generic transmission constraints, as ERCOT is calling them, and how it is increasing over time. So why is that a problem? Is because, as Nikita was talking about, it complicates, it adds a number of constraints to security constrained economic dispatch and basically complicates the solution and how long time it takes to dispatch in real time. Also, these constraints are different to thermal transmission constraints, as you know, as we know them, because the limits on these constraints, they are variable and depend on system conditions and on grid topology at any given time. So ERCOT has to determine limits for this 18 constraints in the day ahead every day. So it basically complicates overall engineering work. And what you can see on the right-hand side, obviously this results in a curtailment of wind and solar generation. So what you can see in the solid lines here with percentages is percent of curtailment on annual basis of wind in blue and solar in this orange color versus installed capacity of wind and solar over time. So again, wind is in light blue and solar is in yellow. And so as you can see, the curtailment is growing over time as a result of these growing stability constraints. So traditional ways to mitigate these constraints, if you would like to avoid curtailment, is then installing additional transmission equipment. And so what you can see on the left-hand side is a synchronous condenser. So this is a type of synchronous machine that doesn't have a prime mover, so it only has a synchronous generator basically it can provide inertia and system strengths. It has less inertia than a traditional synchronous generator because it doesn't have a turbine, but there is a way to increase its inertia contribution by adding a flywheel. And if you look at this middle chart here, it's showing that ERCOT currently has 2 synchronous condensers already installed in 2012 in Texas Panhandle to increase grid strengths there, and currently is looking to install 6 more 350 MVA synchronous condensers to support system strengths in the western part of the grid. Another solution that can be looked at is building more transmission. And so this transmission here is not needed for additional transfer capability, but it is built in parallel with already existing export path from weak grid area. And what it does effectively, it just reduces electrical distance from a weak grid area to stronger grid, basically making the weak grid area stronger. But it's very expensive because you need to build this, large transmission lines that actually are not just for current carrying capability, but rather to effectively bring inverter-based resources closer to a strong grid source. But anyway, to summarize, all of these methods, they are resulting in additional transmission costs.
Joy, you have 5 more minutes.
Oh, all right. I'll try to speed up a little bit. So what you see on the right-hand side here is interconnection of batteries in ERCOT from 2020 to 2025. In blue, you already see 3 gigawatts of battery already installed on ERCOT grid. And on the left-hand side here, you can see the locations of the largest batteries. In this burgundy color, you see that there is 7 gigawatt more that are with signed interconnection agreement and financial security posted in the interconnection queue in ERCOT today, and 3 more with just signed interconnection agreements. So basically, there's nearly 11 gigawatt of additional storage being planned to be built by 2025. And here on the right-hand side, you can see where the storage is going. And basically around 3 gigawatts of this storage is going into weak grid areas across ERCOT. In the absence of any clear requirements or incentives for grid forming capabilities, all of these resources will be built as grid following, and that may increase system needs for additional supplemental devices to improve stability, and it will drive up costs. On the other hand,
my mistake. You can take more time than 5 minutes because everyone's getting a little bit more time. So I'm sorry.
All right, I'll take a little bit more time. Probably need a little bit more time.
Yeah, it's fine.
All right. So on the other hand, this grid forming batteries, they can be designed to provide within equipment limits most of the services that currently are inherently provided by traditional synchronous generators. They have stabilizing effect in weak grid areas, as I mentioned, and can improve stability for existing grid following inverter-based resources. If grid forming controls are implemented on planned batteries, they may provide more cost-effective alternative and improve stability. And this is because the improvement is provided by inverter-based resource itself, rather than adding transmission assets to the grid to provide stability. And so this is illustrated with this little example on the right-hand side. If you have this part of the grid, and imagine that could be West Texas, you have this part of the grid that only has loads and grid following inverter-based resources. It doesn't have any synchronous generators in this area, and it's far away from existing grid that does have synchronous generators and is stronger. So now assume there is a new planned battery coming in, which will be built as grid following, so traditional controls as we do it today. Then this grid is too weak, and there may be stability issues in this part of the grid. So additional synchronous condenser may be needed here to improve stability of the grid. Additional synchronous condenser means additional cost for transmission assets. But if, on the other hand, this new battery is built as grid forming, then it already provides enough stability for even existing inverter-based resources, and this synchronous condenser is not needed, and the cost is saved because this new resource is providing services to the grid by itself. And so there is a number of pilot projects around the world, not pilot project, but just existing projects around the world. Some of them were built as pilots, some of them are already just real projects built for, there is a financial incentive or there is a requirement for grid forming. Some in Hawaii. Hawaii is currently also looking to install some. There is several being built in Great Britain. Germany has one for islanded operation of part of the grid, and additionally in Australia, at the end of last year, they announced co-funding by Australian Renewable Energy Agency for additional 8 large-scale grid-forming batteries across Australia in strategic placements to improve stability of the grid, and that amounts to 2 gigawatts of battery storage. So just very briefly to mention specifications for grid forming. So basically to deploy this capability, there needs to be some kind of requirement of how they are supposed to behave, or what kind of capabilities are needed by system operator. So development of this requirement started in 2019 initially with a number of projects funded by European Union. Then Association of System Operators in Europe looked into just providing 7 capabilities that are needed from grid forming inverters. This was followed up by some of the system operators starting to release high-level functional requirements for grid forming capability. Notably, Hawaii has a high-level requirements for all batteries going forward to be grid forming. And then they also provide additional requirements for tests that the model of this resource has to go through to prove that it is indeed grid forming and has capabilities. National Grid system operator in the UK has released the first in the world more detailed interconnection requirements, so similar to interconnection standard or grid code that actually identifies what grid forming resource is supposed to do. It's non-mandatory requirement, which means there will be a follow-up market product that they are going to procure this capability through. DOE-funded Project Unify has specified high-level requirements for grid forming inverters by the end of last year. And just very recently, in May this year, NERC Inverter-Based Resource Performance Subcommittee has released a white paper identifying grid forming specifications, verification and modeling requirements for grid forming batteries. So the goal with this one was to provide guidance to utilities and system operators in the US today that are already seeking to deploy this technology. So basically tells them what to do today to be able to test this technology out. And very recently, at the end of May, Australian energy market operator released their non-mandatory requirement for grid forming inverters. So even though there is a list of requirements and you may think they may be different, but and they call capabilities kind of in different things and use different terms, but overall, these capabilities that they're seeking are pretty similar, and that's very encouraging because it means that there is no big diversity between, you know, what operators are looking for. And so I have the list of these requirements. I won't be reading it through, and I have this Black Start capability as a separate thing because not all of the resources need to be Black Start capable, and that requires additional hardware to be added. So just in conclusion, the specifications for grid following inverters are developing together with controls. They use similar terms across the specifications that are available today. Some requirements are more specific than others, and in some cases, the requirements are accompanied by performance expectations during testing, testing applied to models and testing applied to hardware. And currently balance is needed between incentivizing desirable behavior, but also allowing some freedom in control implementation, because this is the controls are still also active area of research and are being developed. High-level requirements accompanied with test specifications are recommended approach today. And then some functionalities can be implemented also in grid following inverter-based resources, and they should be left out in grid forming specifications. So just to kind of summarize all that I was, pitching for today, we have an opportunity to future-proof our system by deploying grid forming control capability in batteries today, because it's a low-hanging fruit for solution in weak grid situations. And opportunity for system operators and utilities to utilize this low-hanging fruit. It may soon pass because we have this interconnection queues full of batteries that, in the absence of any incentives, will be built as grid following, and then we'll need to install additional equipment on the grid to support them. So while there is a relatively small number of utility scale batteries, available on the grid today, then in the next few years, we'll have many of them, and incentivizing new batteries to be grid forming, it may help even deploy more grid following wind and solar inverter-based resources. So with clear specifications and incentives, new batteries can be built as grid forming, and they can help support the grid and reduce curtailment on existing wind and solar resources and also future ones. System operators and utilities, they can work together with stakeholders to carry out studies and look at benefits of deploying grid forming technology on plant battery projects already today, and they can use experience from existing installations around the world and experiences with grid forming specifications from Hawaii, Australia, and Great Britain as a guide. And with that, thank you very much, and sorry I went a bit over time.
No worries at all. Thank you so much, Julia. That was a great introduction to how we can future-proof tomorrow's system by adding a cheap part of technology in today. And I'll just add, you talked about Kauai. They have some of the earliest experience with hybrid systems. I was in a WEC storage meeting with them, and someone asked if is there anything you do differently from what you did in your storage experience? And they said they would have put in grid forming controls on their batteries, on all their batteries. So I'd like to ask the speakers to turn on their videos. If your video is stable. If it's not stable, then you don't need to turn it on. But we've got some cross-cutting questions from the audience. And the first one is really around longer duration storage. Abe Abdallah is asking, will the need for 8-hour storage be due to the resource mix, more renewables, or is it going to be due to load increases due to electrification? And I think maybe behind that, there's a bigger question of what is it that drives the need for longer duration storage?
Sure. So I think that the drive behind for longer duration storage is really a combination of issues, but I think the primary issue is the length of the net load peak, and that can be due to a variety of issues. One is just electrification of heating loads. We didn't really get a chance to talk about that, but if you get more extreme weather, electrification of heating loads, you're going to have the winter peaks, and those winter peaks are longer than summer peaks. So I think it really is that shift from summer peak to winter peak, and that can be driven by electrification. It can also be driven by, interestingly enough, the addition of solar. So you add solar and storage, it meets the summer peak, and then you're left with the winter peak being the primary driver behind potential reliability events. So when you look at, okay, what are the periods that we have to examine in terms of what are the periods that are most likely to have an outage, that will shift to winter. So it's just a combination of things, but I think ultimately it's just peaks in the winter are longer.
If I could add, I think there's also a lot of discussion around these multi-day extreme events. And this gets more into the resource adequacy discussions. But people are looking at how we're going to cover these periods where there really isn't that much PV or wind generation, perhaps, to help with that. And long duration storage is certainly mentioned there. And some of the new technologies, I think, are really very interesting. If they go to commercial production at the cost they're talking about, they're really cheap in terms of capacity, but their round trip efficiency might be much lower than lithium-ion batteries, right? So at first blush, you say, well, I'm just going to hold that for these multi-day events. Probably not, because in the world where we have a lot of maybe some excess renewable generation certain hours of the day on normal days, these batteries could be used even within the day for longer duration, like you're talking about, Paul, right? That potentially you'd find a day-by-day use for a longer duration storage too, in addition to this special capacity insurance sort of play.
Any other thoughts on this long duration storage? We also have a couple questions about electric vehicles, and I want to encourage all the participants to please, you can raise your hand, you can send in a question through the Q&A. But there's a couple questions on electric vehicles here, and they're really asking about bidirectional, V to G, basically the feasibility, if there's of course warranty issues, there's of course infrastructure issues. What are your thoughts on the evolution of what's going to be happening, and are we really going to be able to take advantage of electric vehicle battery storage? Any thoughts?
Come on, Mark.
I thought this was yours, Paul. I mean, this,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think the question, and Debbie's response kind of summarized the significant uncertainty of this, right? So VDG has been around conceptually forever, in our speak, right? And has been demonstrated through pilot programs. And it literally does come down to, is the value of one cycle of my battery to the grid greater than the cost of that one cycle to the battery degradation? And historically, that answer has been not favorable, but there are obviously, during extreme events, the electricity is worth, basically infinity. So I think it really comes down to more on the regulatory side, the warranty side. The vehicle manufacturers aren't, the utility. So I mean, technically I can do the analysis and I can find cases where it makes sense. That's not a problem. But then it really comes down to the regulatory issues, and I punt that to other people.
And I think just to add to what Paul said, given FERC Order 2222, which allows for aggregation of DERs, I think that's potentially down the road, down the lane, one way to essentially use these electric vehicles, maybe not a single electric vehicle by itself, but maybe a fleet of them that are parked at a BART station, for instance, to provide an aggregate response, similar to how a utility scale battery storage resource would respond.
Yeah, I agree, Nikita, that I do think the aggregator concept under 2222 makes sense conceptually. The devil's in the details about how cost effective is it under there compared with other options, right? And of course, well, you already know, to me, everything looks like it's going to be a hybrid, and certainly 22 participation looks an awful lot like a hybrid participation model. And there's complexities about having perhaps multiple injection points and shift factors and all that, about how do you put that into the bulk system software. It gets complicated, but conceptually it's the same thing, I view. And look, let innovation run wild inside an aggregator. Let them figure this out, and if they can provide market services, that would be great.
I guess the last thing I'll add here is on top of like the cost benefit analysis that Paul introduced, there's also a very real consumer behavior issue here, and cost of customer acquisition for anyone to actually make a business out of this. I think we're talking, tens of dollars, if not low hundreds of dollars a year that someone would make from being able to have their vehicle participate. And frankly, the time periods of like scarcity when that energy is worth the most is the time in which a consumer is going to be most sensitive to making sure their gas tank is full, and actually not going to want to discharge that back to the grid in many cases. So I think there's a real consumer behavior element here on top of the like more strict techno-economics.
But Max, I think to your talk, I mean, there's lots of other loads that might participate.
I'd much rather go after the 100 megawatt hour loads than the 100 kilowatt hour ones.
Yeah, even the residential loads with next generation smart circuit breakers, smart circuit panels and stuff, you could actually get a fair amount of market response. Maybe from your EV battery is not the low hanging fruit for that, right?
Right. So there's a couple questions here that are sort of related to what Max and Julia spoke about in terms of the inertia, system strength, and other stability benefits of grid forming and synchronous resources. And I guess for Max, it was around, do you consider those benefits that you get from synchronous generators compared to inverter-based resources when you're looking at thermal storage? And for Julia, it was around, are there projects where the added cost of GFM capability can be offset by these additional system services? So if you guys,
I guess I can start. So I think for thermal storage, it very much depends on kind of the flavor of thermal energy storage you're talking about. if you're talking about thermal energy storage that's designed to actually return power to the grid using a piece of turbo machinery, then you do sort of maintain the inertia of that piece of turbo machinery. There are folks returning power to the grid from thermal energy storage using inverter-based resources as well, like thermal photovoltaics, in which case that's a different scenario. And then on the charge side, the resistive heating can be very responsive, but it is not an inertia-based resource. However, a heat pump may be a piece of turbo machinery that has inertia to it. So it depends very much on the configuration, and some will and some won't.
Mm-hmm. And Debbie, to me, it was about the cost, right? The cost of extra equipment justifies. So it's on case by case basis. I guess in the battery, I mean, I firmly believe that it does, because it's already a storage, is a control strategy that you apply that provides some of the functionalities that synchronous generators do today. So it's just by as little as changing controls, you can have some of the capabilities of synchronous generators. And then it goes into what Mark mentioned about regulatory policy decisions, because currently anywhere in the US there is no incentive for grid follow for batteries to provide this capabilities and this services. And so yeah, so I mean I've talked to ERCOT about it and saying, why wouldn't you implement something to incentivize? And so an answer I'm getting, there is no barrier for them to go for this technology today, for them, meaning for the developers, but there is also no incentive. So why would they go for new technology that maybe, will require more testing on the system operator side, when they can easily go for, already proven grid following technology? It doesn't make any difference. So there needs to be either requirement in terms of, interconnection standard or some kind of incentive. So what you can see, say, if you start running into inertia issues, maybe you introduce a product that's for provision of this really fast injection of active power into the grid when you lose generator. Or there is some kind of new service for grid stability in weak grid areas. But I mean, the problem with waiting for new service to be implemented is that what I was talking about is that in the meantime, all these batteries will be going in as grid following. And then when the service is implemented and they get interested to provide the service, then you need to go back and restudy, because this is still a different control strategy. It's a material modification, what would be called. And so it will call for all sets of restudies. So it's maybe like half of the interconnection process that you need to repeat to be able to do that.
Yeah, and Julia, as you know, the point I was making in my presentation is that software and electronics can emulate any behavior you want. If you do it fast enough and accurate enough, you literally cannot tell the difference between an emulation with a software type system and a spinning generator. There's no difference whatsoever if it's done right, And it turns out that software electronics is often a cheaper way to do that. It's certainly more flexible because you have complete control of the behavior. You can do things that no synchronous generator could do. And we're seeing some cases where you can do much better than just what any synchronous generator can do. We just never had that option to even study that or think about it before. It wasn't even possible, but it is now. The other point is that, putting on my industry hat, the industry hates having to go out and do after the fact refits, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're right. I mean, particularly with electronics with storage, you've already got everything you need, including a bit of storage to do some of these features that Julia's talking about. You don't in a standalone PV plant, right? To do this, but more than anything, once these projects are built, they're contracted, they're sold, or under all sorts of contractual obligations, and there's no budget to really go out and do retrofits. So the sooner you can get that in as standard and make it more, that, hey, this is mainstream in the inverter manufacturers, the cheaper it will be, and the difference in cost upfront become negligible.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So we want to push for rapid standardization on this and just move in that direction for at least the necessary portion of the inverters that need to provide that behavior.
Yeah. One more plug that I just, I wanted to put in the presentation, but then cut it out for shortness is if you look at Hawaii today, they are reaching this 90-100% of inverter-based resources at certain times. And they basically having to rely on grid forming batteries already today would provide reliability. So they don't have any other choice basically. Whereas in the bigger interconnection systems, in Eastern interconnection, Western interconnection, there is this chance to test it out safely until we get to times when we actually need to rely on this technology for reliability. And so if we wait until, we reach 90% and then we need to go for it, then maybe it's too late. And maybe now in a safer environment, while we still have synchronous generators to support reliability, we can test it out, iron it out, find out what type of controls we actually need and move it forward.
Great, thanks. I think maybe one last question. There's a couple questions about the modularity of storage resources. So like, if you need an 8-hour resource, why not have 2 4-hour resources? What would be the difference? Or alternatively, what if you need a longer duration? Can you just take a shorter duration resource and just run it at lower output? So how can we, what do you think are the pros and cons of doing different modular approaches?
Okay, so this really gets into what you're being paid for. So if you've got 2 4-hour batteries and you want to use them for 8 hours, you then have to derate them each by half. And so if you went in and went to the bank and said, I'm going to get, full capacity credit and then derate them, that's your money. So it really comes down to how you're getting paid for the different services. So we have seen some interesting evidence that derating may be worth it depending on the grid mix. So you can have some really interesting things where if you've got like a 4-hour battery, you can take advantage of like the high power curtailment events that happen with PV, like in California, and then discharge it over a longer time. So you're going to trade off that derate versus the ability to store more. So that's an optimization question that is going to be local, and that's going to happen in high PV areas. That's not going to happen probably in high wind areas. But in general, yes, there's no technical reason why you can't derate. It's just a matter of, do you want to take the financial hit of derating?
I guess just jumping in with so prior to my current role, I was at RPE and worked on the long duration storage program. So putting that hat on, the thing that makes long duration storage technologies unique and interesting are not that they last for a long time, it's that they're really cheap. So generally it's that you've done a trade-off for a battery that is poorer performing on some attributes like round trip efficiency or like its C rate. So sometimes a long duration battery is really just a low power battery. It's not capable of going any faster. And so the relevant feature of a long duration battery is that it's really cheap, and that you've made a set of trade-offs that make it appropriate for those longer durations. If you're just taking sort of 2 4-hour batteries, generally you're overpaying for other performance attributes that are not valuable in the long duration market.
Just a normal operation of a lithium-ion battery plant, I mean, you actually are replacing and upgrading various batteries over every through the 10-year period. As you get degradation, you'll add more cells, right? And so it can be relatively simple, and relatively is the key word here, to add additional storage capability behind those battery inverters, and keep, that's why we can keep them running at full capacity, even as they degrade over time, even before you do a complete replacement, right? If you ever do that. But what Max has said, why will we not be combining some of these various battery technologies together with this electronics if we have the ability to do that, where I can get that cheap, maybe inflexible, limited storage from the long duration storage, but make it look just like a state, the best lithium ion with the, some lithium ion, some electronics, and the right way to participate in the market. So I think we really have to look at that flexibility. And it's the key point of hybrids is that it encourages innovation by that project owner to make the project more capable. And it can try out this emerging technology in creative ways if we give them the freedom there behind that point of interconnection to do that.
I want to add something to that because that's a really important point. And one of the beauties of storage is, and this is going to sound weird, one of the beauties of something like a lithium-ion battery is its relatively short life. So why would I say that, right? I mean,
yeah.
Well, when you do the life cycle cost analysis, that's built in. So you're going to compare a 12 or 15-year asset to a 30-year asset. You pencil that out using the fact that it's going to cost more, right? The annualized cost of a 12-year asset is going to cost significantly more. But you pencil that in, and it still makes sense. And now at year 12, when it's paid for itself, you get to deploy the next generation technology, and you're not stuck with the heat rate of a gas plant, from a 30-year vintage. So again, the math builds in the inherent flexibility and modularity of storage. And I think that's a really cool thing that really kind of dovetails nicely with what Mark just said.
Yeah, you're right. When we retrofit these in 10, 12 years, it's going to be a whole new generation of batteries with cheaper, more capable, right? And I'm just saying, you take that to the ultimate conclusion is, hey, turn innovation loose in some capsulated way back there. It's just amazing stuff what we can do. But if we have to go and get a new participation model or a new interconnection study for that all the time, if the electrical properties change at the point of interconnection, absolutely study it. You have some way of restudying these projects so you can upgrade them. But if it doesn't change, why would you not want people to freely be installing this new technology?
Right. Well, that was a really great discussion. We're going to move now into the breakout rooms. And I think Jessica is going to set this up. Everyone's free to move around between breakout rooms at will. And I would just like to thank all of the presenters again for really excellent presentations, really a lot of good, solid, clear information and analysis and insights. And with that, I think, Jessica, are you able to set that up?
Yes, I am about to open up all the rooms.
But then,
Okay, you guys should be able to roam around the breakout rooms now. And speakers, you've been assigned to rooms.
So